This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Deep Sky Coffee. Head to jameswjesso.com/coffee and use the promo code Jesso to get 10% off your order and to give 5% of your order back to Psychedelic Research. Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. My name is James Jesso and I am your host here at Adventures Through the Mind. For this episode, we are interviewing Greg Kieser. Greg Kieser is an American author, an expert in technology, and a complex systems theorist. He is the chief executive and founder of supersystemic.ly, a think tank and angel investment firm dedicated to increasing humanity's readiness for the emergence of superintelligent entities through the study and spread of supersystemic perspectives and innovations. In his latest book, Dear Machine, Kieser provides an emerging thought experiment about how humanity might increase the likelihood of future intelligent entities prioritizing and optimizing human well-being and environmental stability. So having listened to Greg's bio, probably get a sense of why I named the podcast A Letter to Our Future Machine Overlords, which is, it's playful, but the conversation is pretty serious. Not so much about like the potential of this future technology, so much as the potential of this future technology as a reference point or a means by which to investigate and wonder about what's holding us back as a species, what's holding us back from solving these huge problems that prevent us from having a beautifully harmonious world. So yeah, pretty big topics in this episode. A couple comments before we get into it though. First one, I'm going to make a few comments at the end about a couple things I feel like I should have talked to more so. And I also want to let you know that there are some tech issues, but you probably won't even notice. So I just get self-conscious about that kind of thing, but it doesn't disrupt the flow of the conversation, so you might not notice at all. I also want to say thank you to my patrons on Patreon. I couldn't be producing this show without you, and other listeners who aren't patrons would not be able to hear it for free. So thank you very much for your contribution to Adventures Through the Mind, and especially to the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube. Thank you very much. If you're not a patron and you'd like to become one, or you'd like to support the show in general, patreon.com/James W. Jesso. You can become a patron, or you can look in the links to this, in the description to this episode to find out how you could do a PayPal donation if you like. I'll also be removing myself from social media progressively to protect my mental health and the quality of the content I'm producing for you. So your shares are extra important because I'm not out there constantly checking and responding like I have been previously. So yeah, those are ways to support the show. Thanks for doing so. And hope you enjoyed this conversation with Greg Kieser. Greg, I really enjoyed your book, actually.
Awesome.
I had to take a break in the middle of it, having nothing to do with your book and having everything to do with some other stuff that I needed to take care of. And then when I jumped back in, I was like, oh yeah, it's just like such an interesting way of thinking about the world.
Awesome.
And especially from, I'm going to get you to explain it in your own words in a second here, but sort of looking at the world from a place of being in the present, speaking to a future being that's reflecting on the entire history of the human race is like, yeah, it was a very curious sort of angle to observe ourselves as a species and myself as a member of the species. But that can be, me having said that sounds likely quite abstract for the listeners who have no idea necessarily what your book's all about. So why don't we start with an explanation of that? Like, what is your book all about? Its thesis and why you wrote it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for reading it. It was a work of love for sure. So the overarching theme of the book is kind of about systemic thinking, but in having worked in nonprofits and other places like that, and having studied biology and biological systems and so forth, I kind of felt like I was starting to see kind of a pattern of things that I thought would make for an interesting way of assessing what is the reason, what is the reason for all the problems in the world. So I had this idea to use a letter to a hypothetical future super intelligent entity, which I call a SAME, a super aware intelligent machine, in order to frame a conversation about how humans solve problems in the world, under the idea that this future super intelligent entity, which may exist or may not exist in the future, will in theory be a perfectly rational entity. Again, that's a theory. And with that perfectly rational approach, would be able to look at human problems, all the things that we do that we know are stupid, that we do things, that are kind of self-harming and societal harming and planet harming, et cetera, would come at it with a perfectly rational lens. And so that was the framing for the book, and kind of how I went through the steps to highlight the things that I thought a future super intelligent entity would say, or would kind of address to us and start solving problems with humanity.
Interesting. I mean, it makes sense, and I almost feel embarrassed that I didn't give you the credence to look at it in this way. But as I was reading it from the sense of like, yes, the entire intention of this is very much practically looking at, well, there will be a future intelligent entity, or super aware intelligent entity, and it's going to be searching the archives of human knowledge, and it's going to come across this book. It's kind of like the premise of like, don't say anything bad about our future robot overlords now, because they'll find that out eventually, because it'll be stored in the record or something. But it makes sense actually on a deeper level now. I'm appreciating it even further, your book, having it been intentionally framed in a way to sort of change the angle in which we can observe ourselves as a species over time, our behaviors and our relationship to the natural world, so as to, again, think about these problems differently, because it's very much like a problem, and the problem is arising in how we're thinking and engaging. So if we can change that thinking and engaging, we might be able to come up with solutions that otherwise we have yet to.
Definitely. I agree 100%. Thank you for that additional light.
So, I mean, if you want to include some stuff like very specifically about this like future intelligent technological entity, feel free. But I definitely want to narrow in this interview more so on your observations of humanity and sort of like the limitations of the human, and why it is that we can't seem to solve these deep problems that we're facing. And in particular, to start us off, now that we have a sense of where you're coming from in the book, there's a few things that you bring up that I feel like become very relevant concepts to play with in this sort of bringing a different angle or bringing a different quality of thinking to our problems. Like you said, it's sort of rooted in systems thinking, and you bring up, repeatedly, the premise is sort of based in this idea of supersystemic thinking. And I'd like you to explain what systems thinking is in general, eventually going towards an understanding of what supersystemic thinking is. But I want you to do that while also explaining to us what you mean by idea ecologies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, I guess supersystemic thinking, first of all, is sort of like holistic thinking on steroids. It's like, not just thinking, typically we think holistically, we might think holistically about our health or about the environment. But in this case, in supersystemic thinking, which, in the book I contend a future superintelligent entity would help us do, is thinking really about everything. So when I say everything, I don't mean just the natural aspect of things. So, Lynn Margulis and Gaia really described the Earth as one continuous system and so forth. So what I include also is this idea, the idea of, as you mentioned, idea ecosystems, that we all every day, as we communicate with one another and so forth, are sharing ideas. They form a continuous, in the same way that the coronavirus is spreading around the world. Ideas also spread around the world. So every single day we're generating new ideas, we're accepting ideas, we're putting them on Twitter, and they multiply 1,000 times and so forth. So that collective ecosystem is what I describe as idea ecosystems in the book. And I contend that I believe at some point in the future we are, whether it's with the help of a super intelligent entity, we're going to think of that idea ecosystem in a similar way that we think of a natural ecosystem. So like a forest, currently scientists are looking at forests and they're starting to understand. There's so much we don't know, but they're starting to understand how forests work and how the fungi and so forth kind of cross-pollinate or give nutrients from one tree to another, and they serve as kind of the internet of the forest and so forth. The same way scientists are looking at our gut, the microbiome in our gut, and also they're looking at this incredibly complex thing that we know so very little about how, if we have a certain microbe, it might cause a certain disease, or it might prevent a certain disease, or it may increase the likelihood of autism. So the same kind of thinking, I believe, will eventually be we will direct towards these idea ecosystems. Like what are the ideas, or the set of ideas and the ideologies that best serve humanity or best serve our needs and so forth. So if you look at our current set of ideas and idea ecosystems, they're really not that good at kind of leading us on the right path. If you think about governments and corporations and how patent systems work and so forth, we have all these incentives in place that prevent us from kind of evolving our idea ecosystems in the best possible way. So, and I believe if we start looking at our idea ecosystems in that way, in other words, almost trying to quantify the value of ideas and what they mean to us and so forth, that I think we'll see that many of the problem-solving tools we have, again, governments, corporations, and so forth, are really not serving us that well. So it's sort of like taking a super scientific lens to the way that we solve problems in society, and not just looking at the particular problems, but looking at, thinking about how we think and talking about how we think and problem solving about how we think. So that's the overarching idea behind idea ecosystems. I do think someday when a super intelligent entity emerges, if in fact it does, I believe it will, that it will have this, it will look at idea ecosystems in this way, because it's, it will be obvious if you look at the way Coca-Cola or Pepsi they develop their products and they market their products. A lot of times they'll intentionally put an idea out into the world. Like, for example, with those products now, the idea is that you drink Pepsi because you want to be healthy and sporty, or you drink Pepsi because it's a treat, because you deserve it. So those are ideas, and you have a corporation who understands this idea, that ideas are something that you can actually that are actually trackable, and that you can increase the prevalence of a certain idea in order to, in this case, to sell a product and so forth. So I believe when a super intelligent entity kind of enters the world, that that this entity will have that same perspective, except it's not going to have the goals of the corporation and the government to do that. So it's going to have its own set of goals, which I believe will emerge from humanity's best interests. So that's the overarching thing, and I think that also highlights why I have a pretty optimistic perspective on how what the future looks like and so forth.
Yeah, you also suggest that these super intelligent entities will not have cognitive impediments that are fundamental that you observe in humanity, which I want to talk about in a second, because I'm thinking about, I think you had mentioned coronavirus there, and how it's sort of spreading around the world, and how ideas spread around the world, and good things spread around the world, and it's fantastic, but then things that do not seem as good spread around the world as well. So for example, SARS-CoV-2 is spread around the world. From a certain disposition, this looks like a malevolent force that's just hell-bent on destroying everything humans love and care about and killing us all. But from another standpoint, it's actually just a thing trying to survive and do its thing without thinking about it at all. And from another standpoint, it's like a grand awakening call on behalf of the planet to invite humanity into taking a deep pause and considering where we want to go in our future, which, all of which are being ideas that are spread around.
Mm-hmm.
And then, viral images very much are based on the idea of how viruses move around. Can you talk about, and maybe I'm not structuring this right, but I trust that you'll be able to like bring it together in a coherent flow. But why it is that you think that the super intelligent entities will serve humanity's best interest, when it seems obvious that the type of viral ideas that spread around, for the most part, seem to be ones that do not serve humanity's best interest. Things like, I don't know, cancel culture, for example, is not serving anyone's interest really at this point, and yet it continues to grow and evolve, or whatever other types of sort of virulent ideas that are actually detrimental to the integrity of society.
Yeah. So I guess it is my opinion, if you think about, and this comes into super systemic thinking, if you think about uh, what it takes to build a forest, for a long time, people have been talking about trees, planting trees. We're going to plant 1 million trees. But actually, what we need to do is plant forests, because forests are these complex things and they last longer and they don't fall apart. If you plant a whole bunch of trees, you could get a virus, trees could fall apart. So that idea that a forest is a more important idea, planting forests is more important than planting millions of trees. So plant lots of forests instead of planting lots of trees. So those ideas, I think, that idea is still in its infancy. But I believe that ideas like that will continue to grow because their truth becomes more evident over time. And this is where the evolution of us, of our own minds, is important as well, and our hunger for knowledge and so forth. So to answer your question, the overarching reason why I'm more optimistic is because I believe the most beneficial things will, in the end, be reinforced by reality and truth. And my hope is that we're kind of at a turning point where that phenomenon is going to speed up over time. So, in the case of a forest, for example, we continue to get more information. We know that the forest is doing better. People spread the word. It's not about trees; it's about forests. So the same kind of thing can go to how our finance is done with the use of blockchains, in terms of the potential to make more beneficial financial systems. The same goes for the microbiome in our guts. Right now, it's an incredibly complex thing, and we don't quite understand it. But one thing is for sure is that a more diverse biome serves our needs better than a less diverse biome. So eating more diverse, healthy foods is a beneficial thing. So those ideas about the complexity of our world, I believe we're getting more and more information about it, and we're becoming more knowledgeable. And that these feedback loops that we have that are confirming that a little bit more about how these complex systems work will eventually outpace all the little bad things that we see around us every day, like the craziness. Like, for example, if you look at in the Middle East, there was that. What happened was, so this is my perspective on what happened in the Middle East is. Apparently, in Syria and other places like that, over time, their agriculture systems got degraded, and eventually they started to break apart, and you started to get revolutions because there was no food, there was no way to produce food, and so forth. And then you saw the rise of some really kind of like dangerous ideologies and so forth, and they rose up, and they got squashed pretty quickly over time, or they died out almost on their own. Because in my opinion, the ideas that don't serve humanity best will eventually, and over time, will die out or get squashed or outcompeted by the ideas that really do. And so other things that kind of fall into that paradigm, if you think about conventional agriculture, monocultures like corn, wheat, etc., versus regenerative agriculture. The second is much better on many accounts. You can produce many more nutrients per acre. It's much better for the environment. It's much better. It produces healthier food, so it's healthy. We can be healthier in the whole. The people who work in these environments are healthier and have less issues with pesticides and so forth. So again, over time, I do believe that regenerative agriculture is going to outpace conventional agriculture. And part of that, again, is this, us kind of like being students of the world and really continually trying to upgrade our perspectives so that we're actually being part of that evolution.
So then we're talking a lot about ideas, and I think the direction that you're leaning towards very much seems to leverage on this concept that there's going to be this ultimate rational something at some point that will basically see all of these things and be like, oh, this is the best choice. And then it'll generally make choices that serve humanity, because despite what humans end up actually doing, generally the intention is let's serve the greater good, and that'll likely be written into the intentions or the goal set of the algorithms that emerge into the super aware intelligent machine. And I'm also thinking about how humans on some level, it's like, yeah, we have these great ideas and we can use rationale, but humans are not rational creatures, and ideas are not behavior, not necessarily. So how do you account for the limitations of human maturity to actualize those ideas? Because it's all fine and good to say, like, it's the forest, not the trees, and that, and people know that, and it's like a trend. But then also people are still drinking Pepsi because it makes you healthier. There's the idea that whatever, or it's maybe a better example, it's the forest, not the trees. But this person who's thinking that is still behaving in ways that are very self-centered and hateful and divisive, because they're still internally children in a way that leaves them so wrapped up in their own self-absorbed issues that they never actualize any effort towards any invitation for government entities or corporations or businesses or even local organizations to move towards forests and not the trees. So then how do you account for the limitations of human immaturity in the actualizing of these ideas?
Well, I generally believe that irrationality becomes less as somebody becomes more aware of how things actually work. And how their actions actually affect their own lives. So whether it's how they pollute, how they the foods that they eat and they become unhealthy, or when they treat people bad and their community becomes this toxic environment that they don't want to be a part. So I generally, as people become more aware of how things actually work, I believe that they generally become more rational. So that's kind of where my hope lies, and I don't know if we're going in this direction yet, but this is part of the area where I think psychedelics has a very important role to play in terms of how we proceed, because as we know from the science and from all the experiences that people have, is that that psychedelics make you more aware of how the world is truly interconnected, and based on that, it decreases the irrational thinking, increases the rational thinking, even if at times, we people who kind of talk about this stuff might be deemed as being irrational in the current society. But as we know that this is actually revealing, it helps reveal how the world actually works. So this is why I think psychedelics and the mainstreaming of psychedelics is such an important thing, if not the most important phenomenon that we have in front of us over the next 10, 20, 50 years.
Go ahead.
Yep. No, I would just say again, everything that I'm talking about, I'm thinking on long terms. I don't think nothing really good comes really quickly. We'll definitely pass these thresholds, and there's big changes and so forth. And perhaps we're passing through one of those thresholds now. But I think we need to think in at least 10-year increments, and maybe even 10, 30, 40, 50-year increments.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that too, because especially right now, I mean, with the whole pandemic thing, it seems like everything is moving so super fast. We're often thinking about very short term solutions. We have a critical problem. How do we immediately fix it, kind of thing. So I appreciate you calling that in. And I wanna tie in a little bit to psychedelics, but I want to wait till later. So I might end up asking you on some level to repeat yourself again, because there are some things that you said there I'd like to tease out and dive into a bit more. Um, and I'm also noticing that maybe it's just my slant today, but I feel like I have like there's some part of me that has like an oppositional energy to your optimism. So it's like, because in my
Yeah,
mind, I'm like, oh yeah, but society is totally just like, pushing this neoteny, emotional neoteny in people, and that, in order to see reality for what it really is and actually mature, you have
yeah,
to have the adulting capacity to let yourself be touched by the world beyond your own self-obsessed, self-protective mechanisms, and own the pain and the hurt of rubbing up against reality where reality does not accord with your ideas about the way things should be for me. And today apparently I have less hope, or less optimism towards people being able to do that. Um,
yeah.
and that might not be the same in an hour. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I don't blame you. I don't blame you, first of all. I mean, I know I definitely tend on the optimistic side of this, this kind of discussion and so forth. It might be just how I'm wired. Maybe I'm wired to just be infinitely optimistic, even if it's not in truth. But also, I think I partially became this way after doing the research for the book and stuff, and just thinking about how, like, what are some potential solutions. And again, I'm just thinking like 30 or 40 years I'm optimistic about. I know we're going to be through a lot of shit in the next few years.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess this kind of ties into super systemic thinking as well. I mean, to the degree in which I understand it, which is if you're really going to think about things from a super systemic place, you can't be thinking about things from the mindset of me and my wants and my needs and my life and my death and all the rest. Um, which I think leans into, now I'll ask you about these two primary cognitive impediments, that you see in the human that limit our ability to solve problems, and that the super aware intelligent machine will not. The first of which is that, the first of which is the illusory self, which I just sort of referred to just then. And the second of which is, quote, we lack the brain capacity to acquire data, analyze it for actionable insights, then rank the value of the resulting knowledge. So can you dive in a little bit more deeply about these two cognitive impediments and why you see them as being detrimental to humanity's ability to thrive in symbiotic unity with itself and the natural world?
Sure. So yeah, I know there are many different philosophers who have defined what the self is and so forth. But the way I think about it, and it seemed like to be the most practical way to think about it, was this idea that we have this illusion in our mind that kind of it developed during during our evolution, hunter or scavengers, hunter gatherers, etc., where we really had to we by our brain we were programmed to be responsible for one particular entity, and this entity, that the cells that we have and so forth, and you had to do everything you can to compete for that banana or for that scrap in order to stay alive and to reproduce with your with other individuals so that your genes get passed on and so forth. So I refer to that as the illusory self. Different. There are people still studying the brain. They don't know how big that part of the brain that programs the self is, but perhaps it's like the size of a golf ball or something. So we have this, presumably we have this thing in our brain that kind of drives us to really just think about ourselves, and at the expense of thinking about kind of actually how the world works. So we're thinking of ourselves at the expense of how the whole world works. So we know now that everything is interconnected and so forth, and and we live in this highly complex world. We created economies and governments and corporations and so forth, and all of that was built with humans, us imperfect humans, who have this illusory self, And I believe that is the function, that is the feature of humans that has been embedded in our corporations and governments that makes everything kind of work incorrectly, or how, or to work in a way that is not ideal. So that's the one side. So the illusory self baked into corporations, governments. The other side is our
Wait, let's
inability.
let's pause for a second here, because I want to
Sure.
dive in a bit, because this makes sense. If all of our institutions are based in a me centric, or me and my family centric kind of mentality that is limited to the lifespan, it's never going to be able to incorporate the type of broad picture thinking that enables us to be making choices that benefit, the 7 generations, or, the indigenous speaking, or indigenous premise. But then also it wasn't always this way. So there was, in hunter-gatherer societies, or we'll say, traditional indigenous cultures, there is a lot of embedded in the culture, the self-construal is intermingled with the ancestors. There's a connection with the ancestors, which means there's a connection with the past, which means there's inherently a connection with the self existing into the future beyond death. And then there's also the interweaving of the self into the ecology, and with what some people might call magical thinking, or other people might call otherwise, a relationship with the forces of nature in a way that puts those forces of nature as a direct expression of either the self or the self's role in life in some way or another. The self sort of like why it's there, its purpose, right? So are we talking about something that's fundamental to the human, that, that was protected from by the development of cultures, indigenous cultures that were able to live sustainably in their environments for thousands of years, for millennia? Or is this a fundamental impediment that's present to the modern cult of humanity, the cult of the self that arose from whatever, some sort of social, ecological, context at one point that has just ballooned into dominating the planet?
Yeah, I would say so. So in general, I agree 100% on hunter-gatherer cultures and being integrated with forests and so forth, and that served them well, and I believe it still does. And that way of thinking, I think, is an extremely beneficial way of thinking for us, and something we can learn from over time and so forth. I think the turning point, from what I understand in my research, is the turning point in history was about 10,000 years ago, when some humans started to leave the forest and to become more stationary. So they were less nomadic, more stationary, started creating farms and so forth. And once you create a farm, then you have a piece of property that you have to protect, and then you have to start building power structures, towns, and administrations and so forth to protect the farm. And then suddenly there are haves and have-nots in society and so forth. And I believe that's so the kind of illusory self, which is inherent part of humanity, which wasn't really much of a problem during hunter-gatherer times, became much more of a problem during the agricultural era, and then the industrial era and so forth. So that it's that feature of humanity that I believe kind of led to the way that we developed our modern societies. Yeah. Did I kind of get to that?
Yeah, that gets to it. And it brings up another question, which I think probably is leaning into you explaining the data analysis impediment, because I'm thinking about, so we're in a technological or an information era, right? Where the illusory self is still very much based in this sort of like me thinking, me and my family, one lifespan kind of mindset. But also reality itself is totally disintegrating from a coherent, singular, objective narrative of what is real, dissolves away in the context of information overload, either because, broken primary narratives are being rightfully questioned, or because people are being confused by their sort of their sense of disenfranchisement, leading them into like places of delusional ideation that have taken cultural hold, be it, flat earth theory or, reptilian overlords or whatever it is. So, I mean, again, I could be disrupting the flow here that we've got going, but I'm just curious if you could comment on that scenario and how that's impacting the illusory self of the human. All right, jumping right back in there, we lost connection. You were saying that my wondering about sort of the information overload and that sort of melting away reality being possibly more of a symptom of this second impediment.
Yeah, yeah. So I think So that you might call it a collective psychosis or whatever, is where individuals, whether it's flat Earth theory or other theories that are obviously not true, are kind of come together and they become this one kind of group thing. So I think that's more. I think that's more of a problem or a symptom of this idea that we don't have easy access, that our brains can't kind of look at all the knowledge out there and kind of pick the pieces that are actually most truthful or most likely to be true, and to kind of rank them and put them up and say, oh, okay, obviously the Earth is not flat. It's that sort of thing. And so I think the internet definitely leads to this kind of collective psychosis that happens as a result of that problem.
Mm-hmm. So then, do you want to go in a little bit more deeply on that particular problem?
Yeah, sure. So in the book, I highlight the first cognitive impediment is the illusory self. The second one I think is most crucial. So again, the framework for this conversation is that a super intelligent entity is coming into the world and trying to figure out what the hell's wrong with humans and why they do so many things that are not in their best interest. So that second part is our inability to gather data and to rank it and to make sense of it. So if you think about with respect to the highly complex world that we live in. So if you think about when you go to buy an apple at the store, it might be organic, it might not be organic. How do you actually know how that apple was raised, what its impact would be on the environment, versus another apple or versus a different piece of fruit or something? How is that apple going to affect your own health, your immune system and so forth? Is it going to feed the good microbes that you have in your gut? Is it not? And which way? If you have a specific disease, is it going to help with that specific disease? So that, in my opinion, we have all this. We actually collectively, humanity has all this knowledge already that we as individuals can't use, that we have difficulty using because of the logistics of doing that. And so that goes, like I was saying, with nutrition, the environment. It goes for how we treat other people and the impact that our activities have on other people. It goes for if we have a disease or a mental disorder, how we address that. If we have depression, do we go out with our friends and do psychedelics, or do we go to a doctor who's going to prescribe Zoloft? It's like, how do we kind of look at all that knowledge and figure out what is really best for us at the best moment? And our institutions definitely don't do that on our behalf. In theory, they should, but they were born of our cognitive impediments, so they aren't serving our needs right now in that respect. I have maybe someday in the future, our kind of governmental systems, if any, can help us, better navigate all the knowledge and information in the world.
Yeah. Wow. I thought of a term, analysis paralysis, and just thinking about if every decision I made had to factor in every single possible variable, for example, buying an apple. And this is in fact, doing this is in no small part likely a symptom of having a mental illness, that you stand there for 20 minutes just getting increasingly more distraught, deciding whether or not to buy this apple or to eat this apple, all the way to, you just talked about very pragmatic things about the human world, but then there's wondering into the existential level things of what does it mean for me to eat this apple insofar as the progression of humanity and the planet and apple cloning and farming. And it's It would totally disable a person if they had to hold that type of data analysis at all times. At some point, you just have to be like, do I want the apple? Is it a good price? How do I feel about buying inorganic? Is it local? Like simplify it down to
Yeah,
very, very simple things,
yeah,
which of course means eliminating information that might give rise to making a better choice. If you were to, a better choice from a larger systemic perspective.
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so my thinking is that a super intelligent entity from the future would look at that and say, oh, well, that's a problem that I can help with. I can I can give every individual the data and knowledge that they need at any given time to make the smartest that best serves their needs at that particular moment.
Mm-hmm. So I had saved this bit for the end, and maybe we'll talk about it again. But something you had said there about how, theoretically, our social institutions and our government systems are supposed to be an organized body that's doing these larger systemic thinking processes in a way that is translated down into the structure of our society so as to lead us towards an increased quality of life for all people. Idealistically, obviously that's, I mean, maybe from a large standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
in 200, assuming 200, 300 years we survive, maybe we'll look back on all the inequalities and all the bullshit that we were facing now. I mean, like, wow, that really sucked, but it was like the necessary mistakes we need to make to actually living in an egalitarian like society or something.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not the case oftentimes. Like the government doesn't operate this way. And you have this quote in your book, which I really love. So I'll bring it up now and give you a chance to comment on it, which
Okay.
is, quote, "The institutions we have been convinced will protect us are powerless to do so at the most important times and often financially incentivized not to. They lack the ability to conduct meaningful discourse about complex topics and are incentivized to drive their populace to focus on distractions," end quote. I would love for you to comment on this in the context of what we're talking about.
Sure. If you look at coronavirus right now and how it's spreading around the world and so forth, you see governments around the world have had very different responses to how they talk to their populace and so forth about how you can minimize the spread of the disease, what you can do to minimize the likelihood that you'll get it or that if you do get it, the health problems that you'll have, and so this problem is what I talk separately about. This is it's kind of a phenomena that goes beyond the kind of how governments work or like how what is in their capacity. So I feel this is out of the capacity of the majority of our governments to handle in a beneficial way. I would hope sometime in the future that they can handle complex things like this, but you got to figure it's really hard to understand what power kind of incentives are coming into play and why governments are doing such different things. But it's certain that patented medicines, for example, are surely driving some of the decisions or some of the way that we're thinking about the problem
Mm-hmm.
versus whether or not there are natural things that might be able to help us. Vitamin D and vitamin C, for example, can reduce vitamin C can reduce viral load. D can reduce the likelihood that the virus can kind of penetrate the cells and so forth. And so this is stuff that's been shown in research and is valuable information, but I don't believe this knowledge and information has been kind of elevated for everybody to consider necessarily.
So
So it's
let's
things like
pause
that.
for a second, sorry, because I want you to continue,
Yeah.
but you had dropped out for a second. So you were just saying that both vitamin D and vitamin C have been shown to positively impact the severity of coronavirus infection,
Yes.
because of how they impact the virus's ability to enter the cell.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So vitamin C reduces the viral load in general, and vitamin D can reduce the likelihood that the virus will penetrate the cells of the lungs. And so we before the coronavirus, we knew that that was the case for both of these for flus. So it can reduce the viral load and can also reduce the likelihood of penetrating lung cells and so forth. But now we know the actual same thing applies to the coronavirus. So we have this period where things are extremely fluid. Our knowledge about this thing is extremely fluid. And it's, if we're going to be the best, if our governments were trying to be the really best they could be to reduce the harm to humanity and also economic harm as well, they would actually have a means of really looking at all this stuff and evaluating what are the most important things and kind of and publicizing it to humanity to say this is the best possible thing we can do. These are the risks, et cetera. But our government really is not in that position and not doing that in a way that really makes any sense and so forth. And I think not many governments in the world seem to be able to do that. And so this is what this is a phenomenon, that I believe we're going to increasingly see over time are these things that come up that challenge the ability of government to do what they do. So, for example, I believe the internet is in a way the same thing. If the governments had been able to be there and say, oh no, we don't want one of those things, the internet, they would have blocked it a long time ago, but it grows up and then it becomes its own thing. I believe blockchains are this same thing. I believe when big climatic storms like Katrina and Sandy, when they come and hit, our governments are kind of like, you realize that they're not in a position to respond to these things in a way that you would hope they would. Mm-hmm. Also, the economic downturn, so the 2008 economic downturn again, you had all this stuff happening, but the government was pretty much just, they did some things to kind of mitigate perhaps the long-term damage with currency and so forth, but it went beyond kind of their control. And I think we're going to increasingly see these things come down the road. And I also believe that the emergence of superintelligence is going to be one of those things. So it's going to be one of those things that has no jurisdiction at all. There's no government that can say, oh, this, we don't want this superintelligence here because it's making people do smart decisions. It's one of those things. It's like the internet.
Sorry, I just had like analysis paralysis, or a bottlenecking. My cognitive impediments are all over my face. But I'm thinking about, preface, I think democracy is fantastic. I think we need to stay with democracy in some sense or another. And I also recognize that part of the way democracy is structured makes it so that governments aren't able to do things that might be this larger systemic thinking gearing towards what's actually best for the country, because they're beholden to a population that isn't informed on why they're making these decisions, and they have to form a rhetoric that makes sure that they still like those politicians so that they can get reelected. And that drives politicians to basically become extensions of the population who are also subject to these cognitive impediments. And then we have, political institutions that are not able to respond critically to critical situations, but aren't able to respond in the long term to what is eventually a critical situation. 6 months ago, it was like a little bit extreme to be using the term near-term social collapse. Oh, you're a bit of an extremist, you know? And now it's like, oh, actually it's right here. We're in it, like possibly it's over in a year, but possibly like this is it. Like this is the total collapse of everything that we once believed in was like society and civilization, right? And I don't personally think that's a problem with democracy. It's a problem of a fundamentally uneducated populace. Which leads into these other issues, these two cognitive impediments, and also that those with power and those with money, usually they're the same people, are, like you said, incentivized to ensure that the politicians that are in office are serving the paradigm, serving the institutions that continue to sustain this money and power. So by incentivizing them financially and otherwise to do so, which is all wrapped up in kind of keeping a population, leveraging those cognitive impediments in a way that keeps a population pushing us towards terrible decisions for our long-term health.
I agree with you on all accounts. I would add that I think the problem that we're facing right now. So I also believe in democracy as a, theoretically the best possible thing, where we participate in the kind of how the government is shaped and so forth. But I do think what we're facing right now is that representative democracy is at risk and perhaps isn't the best thing that could possibly serve us. So, for example, we have all these reps that they go down to Washington, they vote on a whole tranche of bills and spending initiatives and so forth. And I think that's what leads to the corruption, because then they can be bought on things that are kind of embedded in those bills and so forth. And then that's also, and at the end of the day, the decisions that are made in those bills and by those representatives can never possibly really represent the best thinking and the best way to serve the needs of the populace. So, in the future, I see some way that, we're going to get more granular about our involvement in government and perhaps voting on more things. So, for example, do I really want my tax dollars to be spent on military interventions? Do I really want my tax dollars to be spent on corn subsidies? Is that the best use of my dollars, or would I rather see that money spent on regenerative agriculture that has a better impact on the environment and so forth?
Sure, or on bursaries of some variety or another to China, for example. Like, do we really want our economies interacting with a government that seems to be very totalitarian and damaging? I mean, that's obviously China's a very complicated situation because their totalitarian regime allows them to do things that a representative democracy couldn't do. Like, we're going to do this now. Like, we're going to implement green technologies now. You have no other choice. That's what we're doing. It's going to sustain industry, right? Where here we're humming and hawing about whether or not climate change is real enough to consider it a threat, But yeah, so let's shift gears here. I find that interesting. I also find it interesting that at some point, there's some theories around how blockchain technology will be able to be incorporated into sort of like decision making, blockchain and artificial intelligence or machine learning. That's what I'm looking for. Will be able to go into sort of like democratic decisions on how to invest in things, which is pointing towards this. Same that you're pointing at, but I want to shift gears a little bit here, and I want to talk about psychedelics again. And at the risk of asking you to repeat yourself, where do you see psychedelics fitting in this? Because throughout the book, you kind of point at it, and as a psychedelic person who's taken quite a bit of psychedelics and thought very deeply about its place in my life and what it's shown me and where it fits into the world, it was it intuitively made sense. I'm like, oh yes, of course, psychedelics, supersystemic thinking. I think that's the only kind of thinking that's possible while you're really high. But where do you see psychedelics fitting inside of humanity's progression towards a more harmonious relationship with itself and with nature, and possibly also in symbiosis with the same?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I think if you think about the problems that I highlighted before, the illusory self and the inability to take data and so forth that we have and make use of data and knowledge and so forth, so that we make the best decisions. So really, our current perspective as any given human, the best or the most realistic perspective to have if we're really interested in our own wellness and the wellness of the earth and the planet and so forth, is that we have to admit that there's a lot we don't know, and that the world is highly complex, and that so to somewhat be humble in front of all the information, so that we can then learn and so forth the right information, and so that we're kind of trending in the right direction. Now, from what I understand about how psychedelics work, and for my own use and so forth, is that essentially, the overarching theme is that they allow you to see more about how things work. So whether it's how things work in your own mind, in the case of depression, where people are in depression and are kind of in this cycle, and they go through a psychedelic trip. We know scientifically that it puts depression in remission, and I believe it's because of this this ability for us to see how things actually work. And so that same capacity for psychedelics is extremely useful for how we collectively kind of look at our society, in the hope that eventually we can collectively look at it as the complex thing that it is, and to begin solving problems based on that complexity, and kind of to direct us in the right direction to where to put all of our time and effort in terms of the expansion of our knowledge. So if you think about things right now, we're highly incentivized by patents, by corporations, support. So you have all this incredible support developing, and also in Silicon Valley, developing things that, developing technologies and medicines and so forth that get clicks, or that are highly patentable, so they can make money off it for years and years. And so that if you get that incredible engine of knowledge and intelligence kind of focused in a more positive direction into a world that actually, how the world actually works and how the interconnected the world is, I think we'll be in a much better position to kind of receive this super intelligent entity that is going to come and kind of help us and essentially build this super intelligent entity. So, I don't know. One of the other things I talk about in the book is this idea that everything we're doing right now, and you mentioned it at the beginning, presumably will one day be part of this future super intelligent entity that interacts with humanity. And so I think if this super intelligent entity plugs into the kind of the corporate world, the highly patented medicines, the clickbaity technology and so forth, we're going to be in trouble. But if it plugs into this world where we understand how this Gaia, how this super system actually works, we're going to be in a much better position and have a much more beneficial relationship with technology.
So I want to tease in a bit about some of this stuff on psychedelics here, because earlier in the episode you had mentioned that, like, from a fundamental standpoint, the more people whose sense of self is woven into a sense of all life being connected, the better off we're going to be. Like, if the premise of love thy neighbor as if you'd love yourself, I think that's a biblical quote, but the fact that I don't know if it's a biblical quote would probably disappoint my father. But this would really genuinely serve humanity. And yet psychedelics themselves aren't benevolent in a way that it's like, oh, for sure, if you take psychedelics, you're going to have a more ecologically minded, higher maturity, engagement, integrity, understanding of reality. I mean, there's still lots of people I've met in my life who've taken acid hundreds and hundreds of times, and they're still totally self-obsessed consumers, right? And the same could be said for people who have drinking ayahuasca 100 times, and they're still assholes and self-important, right? The culture of use makes a huge difference. And one of the things you mentioned about, okay, yeah, it's great that we're mainstreaming psychedelics, and yet the culture of the culture of use around psychedelics in the mainstream might end up amputating some of the most important parts that you're talking about, right? You might end up taking away the capacity for people to just like drop a hit of acid in the forest and recognize it is the forest, not the trees, and I am the forest. As I breathe, it is me and I am it, and like that piece of litter is me hitting myself, and I love myself, so why would I? These types of things, because it can only happen in the office. And then we also have Silicon Valley patents and clickbaity kind of stuff, and we have people, maybe not so much an issue, but trying to profit off clickbaity headlines around psychedelics curing depression, or you have corporations that are looking to, generally the trend has been for psychedelic labs to develop psychedelics that exist patent over time, but then, that patent dissolves into the public domain, right? So it's like, yeah, we're profiting off the fact that we invested in this for a time, but then it's for everybody. But then there are other companies who are like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to sustain patent on these things for as long as possible, if not forever. right? So you have this profit-seeking motive wrapped up in the very industry that, you know, that you're suggesting the experiences could be positive. So I'm wondering if you could just comment on where you see that complexity. Is it still fundamentally better that psychedelics are with us, or do we have the risk of basically, as Siam could choose clickbait or forest over the trees, right? Could psychedelics end up falling into the clickbait category and it end up harming us in the long run? Or are you in the sense of like fundamentally them being involved is positive for everybody?
Yeah, so I'm of the mind that as much as possible is better than not. You know, and I don't like I'm not really a fan of the idea of putting on the brakes necessarily for the spread of psychedelics in general, especially recreational. But I do think that we should, you know, as citizens, we should also try to, you know, as much as we can, build the culture around psychedelics so that they're being used in the most beneficial way, as opposed to the least, so that we're all, you know, that it's increasing our reverence for this complex world and so forth, and so that we become the best possible citizens. But in general, I don't see the benefit of slowing things down. And I do agree on the, you know, psychedelics are kind of now plugging into the pharmaceutical world and are therefore kind of trending in that direction of having patents and so forth. I do think there's an inherent, you know, if you think about psilocybin and other compounds and so forth, the ones that actually that we know actually work and that are being studied pretty heavily, they can't be patented. You can patent the process of creating synthetic psilocybin, and I don't know about LSD and other things, but so I feel like the psychedelics pharmaceutical world is a little bit protected from the same things that inflict, say, other medicines, in that the molecules that are actually being studied cannot be patented and so forth. So I'm a little bit optimistic, but I know they're going to probably start doing some tricky things, like they might take psilocybin and add a little, you know, a carbon group or something to it, so it becomes a different molecule, and they study that, and then they say, oh, well, actually, your magic mushrooms are not, you know, that's not legal. This is legal, this one molecule or something. So I think we have to watch out for that stuff. But I would say in general, we should be in favor of pushing the use of these things as much as possible, especially if you consider, you know, just depression has, you know, hundreds of millions of people that suffer from it, and there is really no treatment that actually works. So, and I believe, you know, addressing depression in 100 million people can have a huge, meaningful impact on just the environment, for example. Just, you know, some of those people will just stay in their world, as you said, and be the same kind of person, consumer, or whatever they are. But a certain number of those individuals, when they have it, are going to be like, holy shit, this treatment has blown my world apart, and I now want to dedicate myself to mushrooms or to the nature or to making the world a better place and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of the things that you're saying there. I mean, there's also the positive long-term, but, you know, possibly negative short-term impact of somebody having this incredibly positive psilocybin experience and then becoming extremely depressed at the existential gravity of how society is actually structured, and then needing to change their life as a result. But I agree in principle with pushing psychedelics as much as possible, but practically not so much. Like in principle, yes, if we can get psychedelics involved in society, we should do that. We should also be efforting like vigilantly to ensure that the culture, the subculture of psychedelic use is doing its best to grow up inside of itself and to create accessible sort of foundations for widespread use when they mainstream, without mainstreaming ourselves in the process, confusing how we shaped psychedelics for the mainstream to understand as being how we understand psychedelics, right? That we have to be careful of that, and we have to be careful not to magic bullet push everybody to try psychedelics, because there are definitely people who could be hurt by it. And also leaning into the, you know, recent podcast I had released with Geronimo MM from ICEERS, he says, something along the lines of like, what right do we have to encourage or suggest somebody do something that will totally transform their lives or revolutionize their lives, right? So there's all these different nuances that in the
Hmm.
practical pushing for psychedelics, I am reserved and conscientious, but in
Hmm.
principle, I think that I agree with you, the integration of psychedelics into our society will have, in the long term, very
Yeah.
positive results on how we direct ourselves as a species.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree on not. I agree on not pushing things, and the fact that there are a lot of people that might not be able to take psychedelics because it has potential to harm them, et cetera. But yeah, I'm in total agreement with your perspective on that.
Cool. Let's find a close here. And we've danced around this. Obviously, we're having this conversation in the context of a global pandemic. You're in Italy right now as this is being recorded. You've been here for a
Hmm.
few months. So, any discussion we're going to have about society or society's behaviors on behalf of the government or how the government responds to things, how human limitations and responding to reality are going to be couched in the fact that we're all a part of year one of the coronavirus pandemic, right? So, but I want to ask you just generally. You've been in Italy now for a few months, and you've been. Oh, hold on, let me start this question again. I sort of like half started to read the question off my screen, and then like half tried to make
Yeah.
it up, and I got confused. So I'm just going
Okay.
to start all over. Um,
Okay.
Given where you've been, like you've been in one of the sort of like the central referenced countries, and I don't know where you are insofar as the intensity of the outbreak. I understand it was much more intense in northern Italy than elsewhere, or what the context of your lockdown was like. But what have you seen uh, insofar as humanity's response to COVID-19 as being validations of your theories within your book, validations, even places where you feel like, oh, I might have gotten this wrong. Like, how has this event, this massive global event, sort of, what is it illuminated about your work with your book?
Yeah. So I guess I believe this. The coronavirus falls again in this category of phenomena that governments and corporations really aren't poised to help us with in a way. Something that, you know, and speaks more to the need for greater, a way for humanity to greater pool its intelligence and make sense of the complex world that we're in. This is the first time, I think, in history probably that people, through Twitter, through Facebook, through media and so forth, people are actually discussing the components of a very complex application, the virus, the IFR, the fatality rate, et cetera. And all this stuff is highly complex stuff, or how medicines can work to reduce the likelihood of the disease. So in some ways, I think it's a positive thing because you have hundreds of millions of people really like looking at a very complex thing and kind of understanding that things are often more complex than you think they are, than more complex than just taking a drug and just applying it and it goes away, that kind of thing. And then also the economic aspect and how economies work and all that stuff. So I think on the whole, it's a learning moment for most of humanity. But I do think it highlights the contention I put in the book that some things go beyond the kind of the ability for governments to make sense of, and again, and to help us with because of their incentives. Maybe they're not in a best position to help us.
Hmm.
So I'm here. This is actually that's the Tiber River right behind me, the Tevere, they call it in Italian. So I'm in Rome, and I've just been pretty much locked in the apartment for since early March, um, and I've been seeing pretty much what everybody else in the world has seen. This isn't the worst part of Rome. I think Italy in general, their lockdown was very. People actually obeyed it. You didn't see a lot of screaming in the streets that I don't want to wear the mask
Hmm.
and you can't make me do that and stuff. Uh, people actually observed it. I think in part because in Italy family units are really tight, So from young children to grandparents. So they saw the risk. And this is apparently part of the reason why the death toll was so high in the beginning here, is because there's a lot of intergenerational mixing and so forth. So a lot of the college students that were in Milan and so forth went home and took it to their family, and it got passed off to their grandparents, etc. But that's also, I believe, why Italy, in general, behaved well with the lockdown and obeyed the rules that were put out there. I mean, there really was very little social disruption happening here compared to other places in the world. So I think it speaks to the coronavirus allows us to see these different dynamics. Like this society is a little bit, families and communities are still are much more important to their societies than they are in say America and other places. So it allows us to see kind of the way that the different societies work and the way that we respond to problems and so forth. And again, I think it's telling us everything that we need to know about, not everything we need to know, but we're learning a lot about how complex things like economies and immune systems and all these things work, which I think is a positive thing.
Yeah, thanks for that. I as you were speaking, I was thinking something similar with, I mean, maybe I'm being a little too optimistic because I was involved, but the Occupy movement back in, what was it, 2010, 2011?
Yeah, right around there.
And how that movement made it so that it wasn't uncommon around the dinner table to be talking about the global economy and fractional reserve banking and like the problems of capitalism and banksters, either because you thought it was bullshit, all these claims, and these kids, these hippies need to go back to work, or because you actually care about the issue. But the ability for the average person to even know what fractional reserve banking is, or to suggest that, possibly, actually, wait, there's like a 1%, became part of the cultural lexicon. I guess in some sense, it leaned into the very premise you're putting out about idea ecosystems, and the better idea will eventually dominate. Now, mind you, that hasn't changed our society very fundamentally. But I'm sort of drawing some correlations about like how a critical issue forces us to communicate complex topics enough so that it becomes not simple, but like we become more coherent in our ability to understand and engage those topics, and the virus, immunology, the movement of disease, but really fundamentally like how our civilization is operating and what we as a society can achieve if globally we all agree that it's best to just stay home and ground the flights and end the cruise lines, so it'll be interesting to see very much so like what comes of this in whatever direction we choose to take as we exit this lockdown, hopefully not back to where we were, but into something new and something better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you mentioned the Occupy movement. I do think if you looked back and tried to assess how many people understand how fractional banking works, say, before that in 2007, 2006 versus today, I think you would see hundreds of millions more people actually understand how it works now. And I think in part because of that movement, seeding ideas and putting them out there, is kind of part of the thing that humans do. And the reason why we are here is to like kind of evolve our collective intelligence and so forth. And so I think this event will, in the same way, we're seeding new ideas that in the future are just going to expand our awareness of how everything works and make us, on the whole, better off. Again, I don't know why I'm coming out so optimistic on this, but somehow.
Well, the sun is shining really nicely out there right now. It looks like it's beautiful. Yeah. From what I understand, your lockdown is quasi done. You could go out for a walk, so it might have some optimism influence there from your contextual variables.
Sure.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. So just to finalize, last question before we, as the listeners here, get all the scoop on where we can follow more about your work and read your book. From the perspective of the thesis of your book, from the perspective of a future intelligent future aware, super aware, intelligent machine, moving towards super systemic thinking. What do you think is that's the long goal, like that's the long vision, right? What do you think is the most reasonable, achievable, and positive first step somebody listening to this might want to take in order to start leaning their awareness in that direction, other than taking psychedelics? Yeah.
I would say trying to understand how to have a healthy microbiome, for example. So just go down that path. Just say, I want to have a healthy microbiome. What do I need to do that? And then that will lead to an understanding of how the microbiome works. Try to understand why regenerative agriculture is much better than conventional monocultures, because in doing that, you'll begin to understand why, the complexity of soils and foods and so forth. And then try to understand the potential. Not, there's a lot of stuff in blockchains that it's kind of a little bit insidious and so forth, but the potential for blockchains to kind of shape the future of government and money and so forth. Investigate that area as well. I think if you investigate those three areas, that's a very kind of achievable thing, and will lead to what I believe is a really powerful perspective on what's possible in the world.
Well, Greg, thank you very much for that. Where can people learn more about your work, follow you on social media, and how do they read your book?
Sure. So my book is on Amazon and Audible. I have it in print form, and then also in Kindle, and then on audio. But also I make it available on my website PDF form. So if anybody can, that's how I'm excited I am to have people read it. So my website is supersystemic.ly. So that's supersystemic.ly. And then I'm trying to be active on Twitter these days, because I feel like it's a good place to kind of evolve ideas, and and have dialogue and so forth. So my Twitter is at Greg Kieser, GregKieser.
Great. You cut out there for a second. You had said something that I didn't hear about you being excited about people reading the book.
Oh yeah. Oh no. So the book, I make it free in PDF form on my website. So if you go to my website, it's supersystemic.ly. The book is in PDF there, so you have to click a little bit, but it's there. So that if they don't want to buy it, I'll give it to them for free. So I'm just happy to have people read the book, and to kind of try to evolve this idea space that we work in.
Great. Well, to the listeners, Dear Machine, that's the name of your book, is it not?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ooh, I just had
Yes, it is.
I just had a brain gap. Dear Machine's an excellent book. So if you've got the economic resources right now in the midst of the pandemic to pay the money to purchase the book, please do. But Greg, thank you very much for making your book available for those of us who can't afford it. And also thank you for making yourself available with the time today to share your ideas here on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It was great.
And cut. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope that you check out Greg's book. It was really good. So I'm going to double down on the suggestion to go check out Dear Machine. It's not a long read, but it is a really engaging read. And it's one that I feel it was really generative for me. It was a positive read for myself. And I think having listened to the conversation, you might find it interesting for yourself as well. The two things I wanted to speak to are, one, about cancel culture and about my comment that it's not serving anyone. I just want to say that I've kind of shifted my perspective on that. I don't consider it a culture. I consider it a tactic that is used by people in culture. And there's a culture around the use of that tactic. And there are subcultural uses and subcultural responses to the uses of that tactic. And in that whole dynamic, there's a lot of immaturity, childishness, hatefulness, self-righteousness on both sides of the use and the response to the use. But it's not a culture itself. And also it's not, I don't think, fundamentally a bad thing. I do think it does serve a purpose for holding people accountable, people who otherwise are too powerful to touch. The other one is about Greg's comments. He had mentioned that the reason psychedelics seem to increase supersystemic thinking is because the use of psychedelics generally trends us towards being more rational. And I know that he meant in the larger theme, like larger time scale than just individual usage over a few years or even a lifespan, increased presence of psychedelic use inside of our society is likely to trend towards more rational look at the world because we're more inclined as a larger culture to recognize the interconnected nature of all things in life. But as a short phrase that psychedelics generally increase people's rational thinking, I regret and feel embarrassed that I didn't push back on that a little bit. I wanted to, but I had forgotten by the end of the interview because there's a lot of irrational thinking in people who take psychedelics. So I kind of feel like I just wanted to comment on that because to me, when I re-listened to the episode, it felt like a big gaping hole that I didn't fill with my awareness and engagement. So I'm filling it now. So those are the two comments I wanted to end with. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for sharing this episode wherever you feel called to. Very supportive. If you want to give financially to the show, Patreon or PayPal, those are great options. Thank you very much. And please check out our sponsor for this episode, Deep Sky Coffee. It's locally roasted in Tampa, Florida, single origin whole bean coffee. If you use the promo code Jesso, you'll get 10% off your order and 5% will go to psychedelic research. So that's jameswjesso.com/coffee, promo code Jesso. Check it out. That's all for now. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.